morning, everyone. My name is Nick Hoffman. I am the administrator of museums and historic sites at the Wisconsin Historical Society. But I'm here today to actually talk about a book that goes back a little over a decade that I worked on with Jesse Gant. We were co-authors on a book published in 2013 called Wheel Fever: How Wisconsin Became a Great Cycling State. Our research started obviously well before that, started around 2010. So it's just really great to be able to bring back some of this work and share it with all of you tonight. This is actually one of my favorite public history projects that I've really developed over my career. It continues to be a work that's mostly relevant. And I think what I really enjoyed most about the project is the ability to work with Jesse Gant, who is such a great friend and a brilliant scholar, somebody who I learned so much from. So to have an intense about 5 years of conversation about history and specifically cycling history was just really a great experience. This project also generated many other works of public history that just stemmed from our research and writing. One of those was Shifting Gears, which was an exhibit that appeared both at the Wisconsin Historical Museum and then also where I formerly worked, the History Museum at the Castle in Appleton, Wisconsin. And then also at Old World, Wisconsin today, still, there's a wonderful experience there called Catch Wheel Fever, where you can learn and take a deeper dive into some of this research and the bicycle boom of the late 1880s into the 1890s. But it's just a really neat hands-on experience for visitors to Old World, Wisconsin. So I mentioned before that part of our work has continued to be really relevant. And I think that's because of a few reasons. We were actually part of a brand new wave of scholarship that was coming out on bicycle history. And that was a big move away from how bicycle history had been done in the past. Really, in the past, it was focusing on technology and really a sub-story about aviation and the automobile and how those technologies were developed. And so there's been a ton of scholarship that's come from that early work about 10 years ago. So it's just really great for us to be a part of it, but people are really rethinking the bicycle more than just a story as part of a technology evolution for transportation, but thinking more, as we did, about the politics, the social history, infrastructure, all these really important things that shape bicycling culture in the present, and really giving that long legacy about, where all of these things essentially began. I think our work is also very relevant today because our state has dropped significantly, actually during the course of this book, just over 10 years, in the national ranking for the best states for bicycling, which I'm sure is a little ironic to everyone with a book called Wheel Fever: How Wisconsin Became a Great Bicycling State. But a lot of things have impacted that drop. Wisconsin was in the top 10 and we've fallen far out of the top 10 over that time period. And that's because of policy and funding changes. And then also a recurring pattern that our book really points out to, the peaks and valleys of bicycle advocacy, ridership, infrastructure. It's something that's never really been sustained for cycling. But also, I think we're really excited in general. There's so much new scholarship that's coming out. There's so many new source materials, thanks to all the efforts of archives and libraries across the entire United States, and historical societies, digitizing sources. There's really just so many new ways to look at this history. So I guess in summary, it's really time that Jesse and I think about an update of this project. And also in general, one of my works that's coming out of this work is a little overdue with the pandemic, but looking at Henry Stewart, who was a Black cyclist in St. Louis in the 1890s, and how he really challenged the broader bike culture in that community and across the entire Midwest. We'll talk a little bit more about that bike culture that existed later in my presentation. Our work on the back of our book really points to some enduring questions and the legacy that was created from this really early history of cycling. There were really key impassioned debates that were emerging right from the beginning in Wisconsin when the first bicycle appears in 1869. One of those impassioned debates was who should be allowed to ride. Today, that might seem like an absurd question, but in the past, white male riders really established firm boundaries of participation, especially in organized cycling, in cycling clubs, in competitive cycling. And those were boundaries that were set to really empower white men to control the sport. But I will point out that those boundaries were constantly challenged by Black riders, Native people, women, and many others who are pushing for access into the sport. And this is one of those lasting legacies that cycling is still contending with. The League of American Bicyclists have put out several reports about just the overall whiteness of the sport, especially in organized cycling. And many organizations who are active in bike advocacy are really going to have to make major changes in order to bring equity that has been delayed again since the first cyclists appeared in Wisconsin in 1869. Another one of those enduring questions is, where can people ride? That continues today to play out in transportation infrastructure, on the streets of every community in Wisconsin. So it's, again, just something that has been grappled with ever since that first ride. And also one of those big questions that we asked is, why did the first bicycle boom collapse? In the 1890s, cycling was really swelling. It was really starting to get some organization behind it. But I think that question needs to be reframed to, why do bicycle booms collapse? There were many attempts, many peaks and valleys of cycling throughout its history. So that's probably an even better question to ask. And especially right now during the pandemic, ridership just accelerated across the entire United States as so many people sought out ways to be outdoors with safe distancing, and cycling was one of those opportunities. But once again, is that another one of those peaks and valleys, or something that might be sustained going further? And so today, cycling still faces those same advocacy challenges of uniting cyclists into a cohesive lobby. There are divisions between sport and recreation and transportation cycling that many people are working to bridge and to unify advocacy. But all of those divisions were, again, really apparent in 1869, and that legacy plays out every single day in cycling. So what we're going to do today is we're going to focus specifically on chapter 1, where some of those enduring questions really start to emerge right away in cycling history. And we'll take it through sort of the end of this first, we really can't even call it a bicycling boom, but this mini peak of what was called the velocipede era, or velocipede mania, as a lot of people refer to it in Wisconsin. So in 1817 in Europe, there was a lot of different attempts to think about a transportation that did not rely on horses. And there were people who were playing around with the idea of two-wheeled transportation. One of those examples is the hobby horse. There were many different iterations of this machine, but the hobby horse was a very limited fad in Europe. It actually came into the United States. One of the things we've always wanted to research is, did the hobby horse come all the way into Wisconsin? But what I'm showing right now is the velocipede that ended up really coming into Wisconsin in 1869. But the hobby horse, if you looked at it, you would kind of know it's bicycle or one of the ancestors of cycling. Its core difference was that it had a saddle with two wheels and handlebars, but it didn't have any sort of pedals to propel it forward. So someone would essentially straddle the hobby horse and then try to propel themselves along by almost running while they're sitting on this machine. It was really a quirky thing. But people, particularly in France, continue to see promise in that technology. And so pedals were added to the front hub. And in 1867, there's finally a really promising version of this technology, a velocipede that was designed by a Frenchman named Pierre Michaud, that started to launch this movement forward. And it was a machine that was both made of metal and wood. So it was incredibly heavy. And when you hear people refer to early bicycles as being bone shakers, they're actually referring to this early machine that was called a velocipede. And so that velocipede arrives in 1868 in Boston, in New York. It arrives in other major Eastern cities. It starts to slowly push west, but it's this machine that finally arrives in the United States, and it really starts to take off. There's scenes in places like Central Park in New York City that are described as, you know, hundreds of people on velocipedes already pedaling through the park. As people could get their hands on and afford a machine on the East Coast, they were really quick to adopt. And so national magazines, newspapers in Wisconsin, they were all covering the excitement around the velocipede first being developed in Europe. It's making its way finally onto the shores of the United States. And people really waited in anticipation of when this machine would finally arrive in Wisconsin. And so many people were thinking about it and talking about it. At least a few started to design their own machines that were based on this technology. And this is one of my favorites that Jesse and I found in our research. This is the work of Sylvester Wood. He's from Manitowoc, and he patented something that sort of looks like a tricycle. It's a pedal-powered machine. I think my favorite part about it is that it had detachable skis that you can see actually in this version of the patent that could be attached during the winter. Somehow, Sylvester thought that was going to make it easier to ride through the snow on a machine that's this heavy. It didn't actually materialize. Sylvester, this wasn't going to work out, but he made an attempt, and he was certainly paying attention to all the different designs that he was starting to see in things like Scientific American. But this machine is also really important because Sylvester's patent was dated December 29th, 1868, which with all the work that he went into it, he was about 1 week of completing this work when the velocipede actually finally arrived in Wisconsin. And that was on January 7th, 1869. That is what Jesse and I were able to document. What is essentially the first bicycle ride in the state of Wisconsin. And that was by a man named Joshua Town. He pedaled his velocipede through downtown Milwaukee. Again, we think it was the first ride in the state, and immediately, because people have been anticipating the velocipede arriving in Wisconsin, it was immediately a really big deal. It almost made him a celebrity on the spot. In fact, the Milwaukee Sentinel declared that if he was to run for mayor that day, he would have won in an absolute landslide. So it was a really big deal. Wisconsinites were really eager to see what this new technology was about. And sort of in the weeks after this, with anticipation growing, many newspapers actually across the state described it as velocipede mania in Wisconsin. So again, it quickly spreads throughout Wisconsin. We're going to first sort of dig a little bit deeper into Milwaukee and some of the challenges that the velocipede actually had when it arrived in Wisconsin, because as I said at the beginning of talking about its first culmination in the state, it arrived in January of 1869. So in a cold Wisconsin winter, the velocipede first appeared, which is also something really important for Wisconsinites today. I'm a year-round rider. There's a lot of people who ride year-round. They'll ride in the snow, they'll ride in the ice. And a lot of people who aren't accustomed to that really question it. But it's actually the origins of cycling in the state. It first arrived here as a winter activity. So now today, more and more people are returning to those origins. So Milwaukee's cycling scene or velocipede scene really quickly grew. As of course it would be, winter riding was certainly a challenge. They didn't really have the technologies that we have today with the types of tires that we have, studded tires. Again, it was just a really heavy wood and iron machine. And so that was just really tough riding on icy conditions, but especially on our state road conditions. This is a time where Milwaukee, only a few streets really huddled around the downtown area, had really excellent, or what could be considered at the time, excellent street conditions. The further out you went in Milwaukee, really quickly things turned to muddy roads. And in the winter with freezing conditions, those roads were rutted. So there really wasn't a lot of great spaces for outdoor riding in January or February or March in Milwaukee. So we took a cue as a state from Europeans. Europeans had really large gymnasiums, they had large exhibition halls. And so for a lot of their early velocipede riding, they moved that riding indoors. And in Wisconsin, that was going to be a little bit of a challenge. We're not that old of a state in 1869. Our communities were still young, so we didn't really have a lot of big places. So in Milwaukee, they went to the largest indoor space that they could find. And it actually would sit today, I believe, roughly on the footprint of, within the footprint of US Cellular Arena in downtown Milwaukee, but it was the Milwaukee skating rink, which both doubled in the winter as an ice skating rink, and then in the summer, roller skating. So it was a large enough indoor space that people could ride in circles. And this skating rink was established as an exhibition hall by a man named C.D. Veazey. We didn't really get a lot more detail and research on him, but he is really another one of those local Milwaukee celebrities during this time period and just appears constantly in any mention of the velocipede in the city. And he saw a really great financial opportunity with the velocipede riding happening in Milwaukee. So at his rink, you could, of course, purchase machines. That was going to be his primary goal, was to sell different models of velocipede. He also allowed people to rent velocipedes and try to, just kind of practice riding indoors. He also had a riding school, which had to be really fascinating to watch, because not only were people just starting to learn to ride with a brand new technology, something that they have never seen before, but they were also essentially learning from people who had only learned to ride a bicycle maybe a month earlier. So it had to be just sort of a really fascinating experience to watch. They also did competitions, demonstrations, and stunts. They had regular occurring events as they would occur. And then, of course, again, just because this was a new thing, he also had just general admission. People could pay admission and just watch it all unfold. We have the first question actually just came in, so I'll take a pause to answer that. Are there any velocipedes around, or are there some that are on display? Yeah, there actually are, and unfortunately, one of the places that one was on display that was at Budget Bicycle. They had one hanging in their rafters of one of their bicycle shops. I think that bicycle shop is actually now closed, but you could actually see a velocipede. I think they had a high wheel on display in there for a while, and then a couple other really neat bicycles that were made in the 1890s. The Milwaukee Public Museum actually has a very large collection of early bicycles, including some velocipedes. Those are currently not on display. And in the Wisconsin Historical Society, we also have one that's not on display, a velocipede that was recently actually at Stonefield. And we're still researching and trying to learn more about that. But in Wisconsin, those are the primary places where you can see it. Actually, I should add the Deke Slayton Memorial and Bicycle Museum in Sparta, I believe, also has a velocipede that's on display. So you can get some good up-close views of what they look like. One of the other key parts of the riding rink that is really important to point out is that the celebrity of early riding, the person that was the face of cycling in the state of Wisconsin, especially Milwaukee, was a Chicagoan who came up with C.D. Veazey to do this like stunt riding inside the skating rink. And her name was Edith Schuler. And this is also, you can see her advertisement on this slide. This was also for us the first known image of a man or a woman to have ridden in Wisconsin that we found. And this was an advertisement that appeared in a variety of Milwaukee newspapers. So, Edith really was, for many people, the first person that they saw in an image riding what essentially is a bicycle. So the velocipede mania continued to expand again across the state, especially in Milwaukee. And supporters of the velocipede were really starting to imagine all the possibilities that could be unlocked, especially for transportation freedom with the bicycle. And so people started to experiment with the velocipede for recreation. There was clearly an opportunity for riding in parks and wherever good roads could be found. So in Milwaukee, so many of the city parks, we would find just occasional descriptions of velocipede gathering, essentially group rides happening throughout Milwaukee's parks. There were very specific mentions of Milwaukeeans delivering produce actually by velocipede, so much so that Milwaukee first discussed and really had a robust debate around how they might license street vendors who are using tricycles for their goods. People are also starting to commute already in this window in January, February, and March. And our first documentation that we could find of someone commuting to a location was in Appleton, Wisconsin. We found a Lawrence, either university student or professor, was riding their velocipede to school and would park it at Main Hall on campus. And just again, there were so many opportunities for new freedoms. This was going to be an opportunity to break free from the horse. This was a one-time purchase, potentially, with continual mechanical expenses. But if you could afford a velocipede, that would be far less expensive than having to purchase a horse, having to stable them, the ongoing feed. And so people immediately were drawn to that idea that there could be transportation that was, once you had your first investments, was essentially free and easily accessible once you had one in your possession. This is really a great cartoon. Our book was extremely well illustrated. There are just so many great collections across the state of photographs, cartoons, posters, bicycles that are artifacts in a variety of museum collections. This cartoon really shows people starting to imagine that possibility of all the different types of ways that people could use bicycles in their daily lives. It also points out, of course, this transition away from horses. If you look in the background, there is a velocipede manufactory with someone who's injured apparently from riding a velocipede coming out of it. A horse meat market. So they're again thinking that horses are going to be completely removed from transportation at this point because of the velocipede, and then a closed livery stable because people may not have a need to have their horses cared for overnight when they come to visit a city. The new machines also brought a lot of skepticism, and that was absolutely immediate. Often when we would find the first mention of velocipede ride in a state, it was immediately followed up with a lot of hesitation and skepticism by editorial columns, people throughout the state who really saw the velocipede as just, again, threatening to societal norms during that time period, or at least the societal norms that they wanted to see reflected across the United States. There was tons of newspaper sensationalism, and also often stories we found that were just false, accounts of accidents, injuries, even death. There was also a lot of conversations in newspapers trying to control who would ride. And so there were heavy skeptics for women, and especially for Black and Native people potentially riding velocipedes. This also followed with a massive wave of racist cartoons or cartoons that were ridiculing women who were trying to ride. And that is just intense in bicycle culture going forward through the bicycle boom, just that constant attempt to limit access into the sport. Some riders also already tried to define the velocipede as nothing more than a boy's plaything, and others wanted it to be completely controlled and limited to urban life. So the debates that emerged in the 1890s, some debates that still happen today, those conversations were absolutely intense right from the beginning. So despite that conflict, velocipedes really progressed across the entire state. And Oshkosh really is a great example of what that excitement looked like and how so many people were trying to really find ways both to expand the sport early, but also take advantage of opportunities to think about the economics of riding. And one of those was William Crawford of Crawford Brother Carriage Company. They're really one of the first manufacturers, if we could call it that, of bicycles in Wisconsin. They announced that they were going to build and sell velocipedes. They were joined in Oshkosh immediately after by a man named Frank Waldo, who also tried to make and sell velocipedes. Together, they opened a velocipede rink, just like what Milwaukee did with the skating rink. They did in this small building that you can see labeled McCourt's Hall. On the second floor of that building, they had a velocipede rink in downtown Oshkosh. And then, of course, other velocipede rinks started opening throughout the city, again, with the same thing of trying to sell velocipedes to the general public and encourage riding. But we could document velocipede rinks and active velocipede culture in Eau Claire, Green Bay, Superior, La Crosse, Madison, really any newspaper that we looked at, we found this exact same pattern emerging. And in Appleton, this is another just really great example of what a velocipede rink looked like. These were generally always going to be located on the second floor of a building. This is Appleton's Metropolitan Hall. The exact same thing happened in places like Ripon, where a man by the name of Dr. Hubbard actually opened a rink inside another hall on the second floor. These were all just really common ways people tried to access the sport during its peak months of January, February, and March. But the poor press continued, if not grew, and that coverage was consistently skeptical at best. A lot of mocking literature being published about people who are trying to ride velocipede, how to bring it, trying to bring it into their general lives. So we start to see restrictions in places like Janesville, where people were banned from riding on sidewalks, which were at that time, again, by far the safest and flattest spaces to ride in cities. Appleton did the same thing. There were limits on velocipedes really being confined to urban spaces and not allowed in more rural areas or on rural roads. And then advocacy was just a challenge. They were so unable in Wisconsin to start to build organizations that could really push velocipede riding forward as a cohesive advocacy group. The cost of the machines were also very prohibitive of people really joining into the sport. A velocipede would cost anywhere between $30 for a low-end model all the way up to $150 for more of a high-end model, which all of these being handmade generally are going to be somewhere in the $75 to $150 range. So again, this sport, just by its sheer cost, was going to be limited to young, white, wealthy men who had the means to enter the sport and purchase a velocipede. So in just 5 months, the velocipede mania peaked in Wisconsin and then completely fell apart. And that was probably one of our surprises in our research, that by the summer of 1869, it was a complete and total collapse. In fact, we really struggled by July to find any mention whatsoever of velocipedes in these cities that I mentioned across the entire state of Wisconsin. It had just completely disappeared. And that was true across the entire United States. This is just such a short velocipede mania that gripped the nation. But we'll end here. So that's one of the many peaks and valleys of the bicycle movement in the United States. But just like with the hobby horse to velocipede, mechanics kept tinkering with the model. The front wheel was always larger on the velocipedes. I'm not sure if people noticed that in the images, but people kept making that front wheel higher and higher due to the speed that you could gain on a high wheel bicycle. And so in 1879, the next technology comes into the state. Two men from Evanston, Illinois, toured Wisconsin, introducing the high wheel bicycle this time to communities, in that case, all across the eastern half of the state. But once again, the high wheel evolves into the safety bicycle, which is very similar to the bicycle that we ride today with a few technology changes. But once again, the exact same challenges are going to hit the sport. Who can ride? Where can people ride? Can an advocacy movement really get formed to sustain it? But that's something that you'll really have to read Wheel Fever for, to see if the culminating bicycle boom of the late 1880s to the 1890s could truly be sustained. So thanks, everyone. That's the first velocipede mania, the first sort of bicycle boom in the United States. But it gives you a really good sense of Wheel Fever. We spent so much time combing through the archives. Each page is just really full of rich stories, and we really tried hard to connect it to every single part of the state. So no matter where you're located in Wisconsin, not only will you find stories that are very relevant to your bicycling experience, but also how that may have played out in your communities or your region very specifically. Thanks. We have another great question from Domingo. Any presidential or political history around early bicycles? Absolutely, and our book is full of it, especially once the bicycle advocacy movement can really start to peak up. You start to see in the 1880s, especially, you have the formation of the League of American Wheelmen. That's going to be a national advocacy group for cycling. There is eventually, by the mid-1880s, a state chapter that was formed, and then chapters that are located all over the state of Wisconsin. And they are an advocacy group. They're a lobbying group. They had actually a lobbying headquarters right across the street from the state capitol in Madison. And they also were extremely active in DC, again, lobbying to, all the presidents of that era. Occasionally, you can find online, collectors often have advocacy buttons for good roads, and then political campaigns. McKinley, for instance, really tried to court the support of cyclists. And so he in particular really became closely aligned to the League of American Wheelmen. So there's also a lot of cartoons that, show him showing up at like the end of a bicycle race or a bicycle ride, shaking the hands of cyclists, and hoping to transition that over to vote. So yeah, early presidents actually would bring forward platforms as part of their campaigns to support cycling. But everything about bicycle, that's one of the things in our book. The sheer act of riding a bicycle every single day, even in the present, is, you know, a form of advocacy in itself. I should add too, you still see occasionally get out the vote bicycle rides. That's also very much a part of cycling's historical legacy. That's something that's been a trend, a pattern that, you know, cycling advocates for generations have done. And I think one of the spectacles that we really admired in early newspapers, just trying to imagine what this was like, were these gigantic paper lantern parades that usually would happen, you know, in the weeks preceding any number of elections. Sometimes hundreds, if not thousands, of cyclists would show up, and, you know, for whatever candidate they were trying to support, they would have these massive rides through cities in dark that were lantern lit, trying to encourage people to vote for a particular candidate. Well, thank you, everyone. It's been really great after 10 years to revisit this research. It certainly has me excited and energized to get to some of my more present research on Henry Stewart, and particularly African-American cycling movements during this time period. So this presentation has definitely got me back in the spirit to returning to cycling history. So thank you, everyone. I hope you had a really enjoyable experience, and certainly don't hesitate to reach out through the Wisconsin Historical Society Press. I'm always happy to speak to any bicycle club or answer any questions. Thank you. Bye.